Hva får du når pionerer på hver sin felt blir værfast sammen i et malebarisk uvær? Jo, ideen om opprettelsen er en av de viktigste arktiske møteplassene. Konferansen Arctic Frontiers. Den har blitt arrangert 16 ganger og er alltid i den arktiske hovedstaden Tromsø. Her er du i sentrum av verden. Aldri har verden vært så nært oss som nå. Når du kommer hit, inngår du i rekka av tusener som har kommet til Tromsø med store drømmer. Den kunnskapen, innsikten og erfaringen vi får de her dagene, håper vi alle bruker til å endre verden til et bedre sted. Som ordfører i Tromsø er det en glede å kunne ønske dere alle velkommen hit til den 17. Arctic Frontiers 2023, Moving North.
Dear friends, welcome to the Arctic. I am glad that you have chosen to visit us in Northern Norway for the Arctic Frontiers Moving North Conference. Having a meeting place like this is important. Interaction, sharing of knowledge and cooperation is the key in making sure that the future of the northernmost parts of the world is decided in the Arctic, for the Arctic and by the Arctic. On behalf of Troms and Finnmark County Council, we wish you a pleasant stay and hope you enjoy the conference.
Vaimolla Spores Puhtin Sápmi. It is a great pleasure for me to wish you all welcome to Sápmi, the traditional Sami area. The theme for the conference is Moving North. In Sami language we would say Johti Davas.
I will open with a song called Alavas Kuadamu. It's Sami and means don't leave me yet. And it's about transferring knowledge from one generation to another, being on the move into a future that we don't know where it will lead us. Kisaiskaitet, hallidan kierti, يسكر بحالات تجرب النال ما يسكوف ساس سبالا على وس قدمو 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 على وس قدمو
Ministers, Madam President of the Sami Parliament, Excellencies, dear friends. The most important thing we can teach our children is to get back on their feet. It's not about success. It's not about failure. It's about getting up and moving on. The Arctic was a showcase for the world on how countries could work together. That has changed. We are amid an Arctic divorce. In the breach, we lose access to half of all scientific data. We lose half of our important contacts. We have lost parts of our influence in the Arctic. We who are here today must chart a new course. A course through a landscape where military and security questions gain ground. At the same time, battling climate change and working for sustainable development, two conflicting goals of equal importance. A new course based on respect for cooperation, coexistence, and democratic values. An Arctic that makes young people want to stay, thrive, return. Provide education, work opportunities, and social arenas that are innovative and inspiring. This is difficult in challenging times. But a crisis can be turned into an opportunity. It's about getting up and moving on. I would like to encourage our researchers, cooperate more. I would like to challenge our politicians. Focus on solutions. I have a wish for our partners. Listen to each other. Then we can create an Arctic which again becomes a showcase for the world. The most important thing we can teach our children is to get back on their feet. It's not about success. It's not about failure. It's about getting up and moving on. Welcome to Arctic Frontiers, Moving North.
Many thanks, Anu, for that opening speech, which really does set the scene for the challenge ahead, but also the opportunity. I'm Susanna Streeter. I'm your moderator for the big picture sessions that we have here in the hall. I met some of you last May. I'm a former BBC anchor and now an economic commentator. And I'm with Andreas, who is going to keep you all informed on the live stream, aren't you?
I am indeed. Thank you very much, Susanna. Thanks for being back here with us after 8 months. It's great to have you here. I look very much forward to your questions, hopefully spicy ones, to our panelists, and very much forward to make them listen to each other. Welcome to Arctic Frontiers 2023. Welcome to Tromsø. It's great that you all moved north in the spirit of the conference theme this year. I'm indeed the conference host, so I will give you some guidance on what's happening next and where you have to go in case of emergencies. For now, just some quick thing on the break. We have a so-called break TV. So after each picture session, I will go outside with 2 special guests and discuss the findings and the very analysis of each session online. So you can still watch it online directly after each session, or you come back to Arctic Frontiers 2023 when you rewatch the entire conference when you get back home.
So you'll be taking on lots of the themes and going into more detail during the break TV. You also have a little bit of housekeeping before we move on.
I do have a very important housekeeping thing before we actually move on. It's about the fire bell and the alarm. So I guess everybody who went to the science session or the science reception yesterday know what I'm talking about. We had a little incident there. I don't know where my colleague Jenny is. She can tell you more about that. But in case you hear a fire bell, there's no tests planned. So please, please leave rather soonish or most likely immediately after you hear a fire bell. There's an exit right behind us. There's obviously an exit at the main entrance of the hotel. And if you go outside the auditorium, to the right, there's also a fire exit or emergency exit, let's put it that way. So I guess that's everything from me from now.
And don't worry, this is just dry ice, so don't panic. Andreas, thank you very much. We'll be hearing from Andreas a little bit later at the end of the panel debates. But for now, thank you very much. So, we're going to focus now on this first big picture session, which is going to focus on 2 key trends for the Arctic, of course, which we're dealing with right now: geopolitics and climate change. Now, in many ways, we may feel as though we've stood still since May, but actually a lot has happened, not least the cost of living crisis that has accelerated because of the war in Ukraine. Now, I was in Davos in Switzerland at the World Economic Forum this month, and the concern is that because of the cost of living crisis, which is affecting so many countries around the world, they will take their eye off the ball when it comes to the funding and the focus really needed to make those changes to power the green transition and also to limit climate change. So that's one of the aspects we're going to be focusing on in the discussions today. And also, of course, what does geopolitical fracture mean for cooperation going forward? Just how can we move on? What are the channels available? We're going to be getting the perspectives, of course, from nations across the Arctic and also other nations around the world on this. But first, we're going to get Norway's perspective. And I'd like you to give a very warm welcome to Her Excellency Anniken Huitfeldt, who is, of course, Norway's Minister of Foreign Affairs. Welcome.
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so pleased to be back at Arctic Frontiers and also back here in Tromsø. Just 2 weeks ago, I attended Tromsø's International Film Festival, and I saw the Icelandic movie A Letter from Helga. I noticed that Iceland's Minister of Foreign Affairs received a special thanks all over the screen in the closing credits. So I'm happy to be able to convey these thanks in person to you today, Thordis. Welcome to Tromsø. Set in the dramatic fjords of Iceland, the film conveys the main character's attachment to nature. I don't want to spoil too much of the plot, but sometimes this attachment can be so strong that we choose passion for NATO, for nature. We've been discussing NATO with my colleagues earlier on today, but Nordic sometimes, our attachment to nature can be put in front of love. That was my message. And the passion for nature and exploring the outdoors has always united us here in the north. 1.5 centuries ago, the same passion led the Finnish-Swedish explorer Adolf Erik Nordenskiöld on many expeditions in the Arctic. In 1879, he was the first to complete the entire Northeast Passage, the sea route from Europe to the northern coast of Asia that runs along the Arctic coast of Norway and Russia. Today, another Swede is crossing an Arctic frontiers of his own. The newly appointed Swedish Minister of Foreign Affairs is on his first official visit to Norway in his new capacity and visiting North Norway for the very first time. So warm welcome to you, Tobias. And together with Johanna, State Secretary from Finland, you attended this conference also last year and wanted very much to get back to Tromsø. When Nordenskiöld completed the Northeast Passage 150 years ago, his ship was stuck in the ice for almost 10 months. Today, his voyage would have been much less difficult for deeply disturbing reason, namely climate change. Last summer, researchers from Norway and Finland found that since 1979, the Arctic has warmed nearly 4 times faster than the rest of the globe. The rapid melting of ice is disturbing the environment and marine life in the Arctic. It is also affecting communities in the region, but it could get much worse. It is easy to lose sight of these long-term trends when a full-scale war is raging in Europe. Russia is inflicting unspeakable suffering in Ukraine. As this audience knows far too well, the war has profound impacts also here in the north and for the dialogue arenas in the Arctic. I'm especially pleased, therefore, to see such an impressive crowd here in this room today. This year's participants include representatives from indigenous communities, academia, policymakers, and students from all over the world. This shows that Russia's actions have not silenced the important conversation that take place at Arctic frontiers. So Norway will continue to provide substantial military, economic, and humanitarian support to Ukraine for as long as it takes. Our bilateral cooperation with Russia has been reduced to a minimum. Long-term joint activities have been put on hold. The Russian regime is becoming more totalitarian and unpredictable. However, we cannot change geography. Russia is Norway's neighbor, so we need to maintain some contact to minimize the risk of misunderstandings and unintended escalation in the Arctic. The situation in the north is currently stable. We see a large degree of continuity in Russia's activity in the north, but things can change fast. We are monitoring military activity closely. We are increasing our defense presence and coordinating our activities with our allies. We must be transparent and also predictable. Finland and Sweden joining NATO will benefit the alliance and make our region more stable. I am convinced that it will lead to further Nordic cooperation here in the north, not only in the area of defense and security, but also in areas such as the green transition and infrastructure. The high-level Nordic attendance here shows that my good colleagues share this view. Finland is currently chairing the Barents Euro-Arctic Council, where activities without Russia are continuing. We fully support Finland's effort to keep the Barents cooperation alive. Norway is ready to take over the chair of the Arctic Council in May. We are doing what we can to ensure an orderly transition from Russian to Norwegian leadership. Normal political cooperation with the current Russian regime is not possible. Under our chairmanship, the work of the Arctic Council will reflect this political reality. But we must make sure that the Arctic does not become the only region in the world with no effective multilateral cooperation. The Arctic Council's work on climate and environment is of great global importance. The participation of indigenous peoples is a unique asset. The actions we take today will have consequences for cooperation in the Arctic for decades. A long-term perspective is essential. It is our ambition as chair to resume the work of the Arctic Council, and that means engaging with all of its member states. I look forward to presenting the program for our Council's leadership here in Tromsø in March. Friends, in today's unpredictable security policy landscape, we need resilient communities here in the north. Ensuring that people can and want to live in the Arctic is more important than ever. I sometimes have to remind colleagues from elsewhere, the Arctic is not a museum. Sustainable economic development and job and education opportunities will be vital from a foreign policy perspective as well. It is also vital that we maintain our focus on the green transition. Nordenskiöld, the Finnish-Swedish explorer I mentioned earlier, was also a pioneer in terms of his concern for the environment. On his first expedition to Svalbard, Nordenskiöld saw that the greedy eider hunters collected the eggs and killed most of the birds. In 1880, he wrote, "If the hunters saved the birds, which they are now shooting just for their expensive feathers, and if they stopped collecting eggs from the beginning of July or took only the fresh eggs, perhaps the number of eiders would multiply." This is a fitting image of this long-term approach. We need more of this long-term approach today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. And I'd like actually the Minister to rejoin me on the stage, but also please do welcome to the stage as well Thora Skarbron Rekvod Gylfadóttir, who is the Foreign Minister of Iceland. Please welcome. Do take a seat anywhere you'd like. Also Tobias Billström, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Sweden. And please do welcome to the stage State Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Finland, Johanna Asmuvuori. So thank you very much for your opening words. It really did set the scene of the challenges that we have ahead of trying to look through the fog of war, really, and try and find some ways of cooperating. I'd really like to get the perspective now from Iceland and just ask you, Minister, where you see geopolitical fracture really affecting cooperation, and just what can be done? How can collaboration be maintained, and how can it evolve?
Well, these are big questions with, I think, no clear answers at this point. Of course, we are still working closely together, and as you can see of the audience and everyone who's here, but of course it also has had its consequences. So the Arctic, and notably the Arctic Council, obviously, has been a shining example of how we should work together in constructive cooperation since the 19th. And our goal has been for the Arctic to remain a region of peace and stability with vibrant and prosperous communities based on sustainable development. And it was in that spirit where we conducted our chairmanship of the Arctic Council, which was, and the outcomes from the ministerial meeting in Reykjavik, only 2021. It was just, yesterday, but still it feels like it was such a long time ago because so much has changed. And it has changed for the worse. So right up until the day of the invasion, we thought that we would still be able to kind of keep the Arctic region and the Arctic cooperation aside from everything that was going on. And of course, we still talk about high north low tension, and that is, I would say that that's still the case, but obviously it's not, it also affects that region. So the chairing state of the Council dealt a severe blow to the UN Charter and brutally violated the most fundamental of international law. So it was unthinkable that Russia's brutal invasion and the suffering it has caused would not affect the Arctic cooperation in any way. That was unthinkable. Because how were we to continue with business as usual in our relations with Russia when daily witnessing their savagery and complete disregard for human life? When they so clearly cannot be trusted. We simply could not. So that is why Iceland and other like-minded Arctic states each decided to pause our cooperation with Russia and the chairmanship of the Arctic Council. But at the same time, of course, we have a responsibility as leaders and a duty to consider both the present as well as the future needs of challenges of our people and those of the world. So I think, for over 25 years, the Arctic Council has been a platform for constructive cooperation, focusing on the 3 pillars of sustainable development, guided by science and international law. And this is something that I don't think we have all the answers to. How do we continue? But sometimes I still hear voices like what has Ukraine has to do with the Arctic. But for me, it's very obvious. But because this question is raised, I think we have to have that dialogue and remind everyone that for us to be able to talk about the Arctic region as a low tension in the high north, that is a fundamental issue that it is based on international law, that we can trust that the rule-based order is the way we do things. If we don't have that, we will miss the days when we discussed about how should we cooperate on climate issues. Because that's the base, that's the fundamental issue that we have to have in order. So because you mentioned crisis of cost of living, and I know that we do not, values don't heat our houses and values don't pay the bills, but now those values are being attacked and they're being tested. And the Arctic region, like every other region that truly cares and knows how fundamentally important it is that this is the way we do things and make decisions, the only thing I know is that if we fail, we will have more houses to heat and more bills to pay. So that is why we all have to stay together and stick together and do what's right in a very complicated situation.
It certainly is. And actually, we'll be touching on a little bit in this panel, but in other panels, just about whether the situation does actually help accelerate the green transition and then ultimately help with the cost of living over the longer term. But let me get the perspective now from Sweden. Minister Bellström, could you just give me your take on whether actually, given what's happened, you feel as though Arctic cooperation should change over the medium to longer term, or whether you think actually the structures that are currently in place should be maintained?
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. And thank you very much, Anniken, for your kind words. First, I thought that you were going to launch a new strategy based on 4 N's or something, Norway, NATO, nature, and neighborhood. But maybe that will come later, perhaps. Well, to start with, Sweden is, of course, an Arctic country by definition. It is our neighborhood, and I believe strongly that together with our Arctic partners, whom some are sitting up here on the stage today, we have a special role. We have a role to see to it that, we maintain a sustainable development of our region. That is crucial in my mind. And the task ahead of us is to do this in a robust and comprehensive approach. Now, since you ask about the geopolitical and how it plays into this, well, it's obvious that the Arctic has, thanks to the Russian aggression on Ukraine, resumed its potential, its importance from a military strategic point of view. And this, we can see in many ways, not at least because we have the Russian nuclear capability at the Kola Peninsula so close in space. And even though these tensions, they do not stem from the Arctic itself, there's an increased risk, as we see it, for an arms race in the Arctic that we have to take into account. And there are risks of incident that could escalate beyond our control. And this is the reason why I believe that Sweden and Finland's accession to NATO is so vital at this point in time. When we have joined, it is 7 of the 8 Arctic states that will be NATO members. And that will do a lot of good to the security for this part of the world. And as NATO members, we will contribute to this. We will contribute to the security in the Euro-Atlantic space and the Euro-Atlantic area, including in what we call the High North.
Well, thanks very much for giving us that take from where you're coming from, because certainly, as you say, change is so rapid with the geopolitical situation and also accession to NATO. Let me bring the conversation now over to Sweden. Johanna Sommervoy, Finland.
Finland.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Finland.
We're very close.
Yes. Let me bring the conversation to Finland. So let's talk about how Finland's Pan-Arctic collaboration really has changed because of this pause in Arctic collaboration and the involvement of Russia, or has it? I mean, what are you doing to try and breach the gap, really, and make sure those conversations are continuing?
Thank you, and also on my behalf, it's very a pleasure to be here. I was here last year as well, and even though we were, of course, worried about the security situation in Europe and what kind of global implication it might have, I think we are all now here quite devastated how this past 11 months have been actually panning out. And of course, when Russia invaded Ukraine, it changed the whole security situation in Europe, but not only in Europe. I think it was blatantly against international rule-based order, and it was blatantly violating the UN Charter. So we're not only talking about Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine is suffering the most, but we are talking about bigger issues here. And it has affected, of course, the Arctic cooperation as well, as ministers really well described. And even though, yeah, we have some passion for NATO, as we all know, but the passion for nature hasn't disappeared. So they're all these two issues are on the table at the same time, and I think we need to safeguard the Arctic region more than ever, also to keep it out of tensions. And that was the basis of Finland's Arctic strategy, which was outlined in 2021. We put at the core of the strategy the climate change mitigation and adaptation, Arctic people, and especially the indigenous peoples and their organizations, their meaningful engagement and way to participate in the decision making, which affects their life directly, and also infrastructure and logistics. And even though, of course, we have assessed this situation, that is our strategy now outdated? It's actually not, even though the security situation is very, very difficult. We haven't seen actually growing military tensions in the Arctic from our part at the moment, so the situation is relatively calm there. But of course, we have to be vigilant as to different kind of scenarios, and that's one reason, of course, why we also very swiftly decided upon a NATO accession process in Finland together with Sweden. I also believe, as it was stated before, that Finland's and Sweden's NATO membership will strengthen the Nordic and European security, but also it will strengthen the whole alliance. So we would be not only taking security or being provided more security, we would provide security for our allies. But having said that, also we have to look at the nature part as well, as much as before, because actually we have figures from the climate scientists that Arctic region or Arctic regions are warming up 4 times more intensively than the whole globe. And actually, some parts of the Arctic, like the Barents area, is warming up 7 times quicker or more intensively than the rest of the world. So I think it has global implications if we don't do anything, or if we just rest on our laurels and concentrate on other issues. So we have a very challenging time, because at the same time we are getting more and more these foreign and security policy issues, which are also affecting the Arctic. We have so-called hard security issues that are coming on the Arctic agenda, but at the same time we have to do our utmost to mitigate the climate change, because we're talking about climate crisis here, basically. I'm not going to go around that word, because it's a fact. And it's, if you don't do anything, who it affects mostly in the Arctic area are the people who actually live here. So we should be really taking into account that what we had in Arctic Council and still have, even though the cooperation with, political cooperation with Russia has been suspended, is that we had a unique structure, like Minister Whitfeldt described. Unique structure where permanent representatives of the indigenous peoples groups were taking part to Arctic Council decision-making and being part of this decision-making process. We cannot lose that kind of way to work together in this region.
Let me just bring up that point as well that you're making about the security policy. And Minister Huitfeldt, I wanted to get your view on that, and actually how crucial is it that there is the sustained management of not just resources, but populations in the north to bolster the security?
There is no security without people, and there are no people without security. So we really have to step up together, because this is not a museum. People need to live their lives here, job opportunities, education, everything. So these are areas where we really should step up together, because we have the common challenges. And I just want to add that when I was a newly appointed foreign minister, after 10 days in office, I visited Tromsø, and I met with my first counterpart. That was Lavrov, actually. And my original plan those days was to develop new areas of practical cooperation with Russia. That's not possible at all now. There can be no business as usual. But I think we should be encouraged, the rest of us, to step up our cooperation through the Barents Council, in the Arctic Council, because we need to keep this architecture in this region, and we have the common challenges. So we should also use this as an opportunity.
Let me bring you back in then, Minister Bellström, because obviously the Swedish EU presidency presents lots of opportunities, not least perhaps with propelling Arctic cooperation from the outside, but also in terms of climate change as well. How do you see this evolving under the EU-Swedish presidency?
Well, thank you. This is something where I think you could see a lot of interesting aspects of this, but I would like to point back to my own country and say that you have to lead by example. And this is exactly what we are doing in Sweden right now, because the Swedish Arctic region has become a leader in green transition. And that is thanks to many large and parallel investments in fossil-free steel, in the question of green mining, in the question and the area of battery production. And if I look at this, I would like to say that if we manage to pull off the green transition, this is something during the EU presidency, and really achieve so not just council conclusions, but real decisions. I would like to say that we have a better future in store for all of us in Europe as well as the world. And if I look again back to Sweden, we are now going to put forth a North Sweden strategy to help accelerate and facilitate this transition. I'm in full agreement with you, Anniken. There is a need for the local communities to step in and to scale up their populations. That needs to be done in order for us to enhance and get the full development, the full development potential that we have in store. We need to look to housing, we need to look to transport, and without undermining the opportunities of those who are already established in these areas. So if we do this, we can actually put forth this entire region, not just the Swedish part, but the entire region, as an inspiring showcase to the EU, and to the rest of the world for possibilities in sustainable climate transition in other remote EU regions. And this, I think, is something which we are very keen to achieve during our EU presidency.
Well, thank you. Well, let me get Iceland's perspective on this. Of course, Iceland, very renewable energy rich, but right across the region there are vast untapped resources. How do you think these should be best approached for the good of the world, but also whilst maintaining rights of peoples?
Well, first, like you mentioned, we have, we heat our houses with our geothermal, we have hydropower, we have a lot of wind, but we haven't utilized it yet. Hopefully we will, offshore or onshore. And we import, the oil we still import, we import from our friends in Norway. So we are really in a privileged position in all of this discussion when it comes to, energy crisis and stuff. We know that we have untapped resources, and we know about the fossil fuel, minerals, hydropower, offshore wind, and it is, of course, when you look at the regions where you have, for example, untapped hydropower resources or possibilities, we have to respect the will of each region. I mean, this is a sovereign issue that they need to decide for themselves. But I wanted to, because this is all maybe pretty obvious and everybody knows about that, so I wanted to add another resource that I think we have to think more about and how that all connects, and that's the unlimited resource we have, which is the human resource. And I think that, if we know that we have a tremendous amount of untapped human resource, and we also know that, to be able to do that as best as possible, we need to be inclusive, and that goes with the indigenous people. That goes with also when it comes to gender equality. I mean, gender equality is the cornerstone of our foreign policy, and we know, and we did some work when we were chairing the Arctic Council, that, I mean, we could do so much better in that regard. So, and we also know that when you're utilizing your full potential in human resource, you get the good ideas, and we find solutions. But for us to be able to find solutions, you need creative individuals. And you can't be creative if you're not free. So we need to cherish and look out for our societies to be sure that we have free individuals. That means that you are free to learn, free to criticize, free to do whatever you want to do, also free to love whoever you want to love. Because we need all the creative individuals to help us find the solutions, both when it comes to utilizing the resources that are untapped, and also to use the innovative minds to use everything better and find new solutions. So I think we also need to look at the fact that when we are doing business, also with the resources, they are also value-based. That is why we have stopped or tried to stop doing business with Russia, with a product that everyone needs. And we know that everyone needs it, so that means that if we still need all of the amount of the product, and we're not gonna buy it from them, we have to have enough of it somewhere else. That means that we need to utilize the resources so we have enough.
Absolutely. Well, let me get the Finnish perspective now on just how should the green industrial revolution or the green shift, however you want to describe it, how should it be carried out in the most inclusive way?
That's a very good question, and I really liked what Minister for Iceland said about inclusive engagement. I think the green transition is a very big issue. It's a geopolitical issue in the future. It's changing the way how we look at natural resources when the economies are transferring from fossil-based economies to green economies. And actually Russia's invasion of Ukraine accelerated that process in many countries because it started, in many countries, especially in Europe, we started to talk about how to increase our energy independency, how to cut off dependencies from, for example, Russian oil and gas. And that's why it started to accelerate. So where the natural resources for the green transition are placed affects the geopolitical balance as well. But how should it be done in a way that it doesn't become the kind of a geopolitical battleground You mean, and in a way that the competition leads to sidelining the people who actually live in those regions, for example, where most of the natural resources are sourced. That is a political question, and that's why we need some kind of ethical guidelines and political decisions how to actually engage those people who live in, for example, in the Arctic region, if you talk about the Arctic natural resources. So I think Finland has had this stance already before Russia invaded Ukraine. It's one of the core principles in our Arctic strategy, and we need to cooperate together with the, for example, in this region, with the people and their local councils, but also with indigenous peoples' organization, and make the meaningful decision making and cooperation meaningful. It can't be just words.
Okay, Hannu Tuomivoli, thank you very much. And this is a great time actually to bring in two other contributors to the panel. So please do welcome Silja Karin Mutka, who's the President of the Sami Parliament of Norway, and also Douglas Jones, Deputy Assistant Secretary for the European and Eurasian Affairs at US Department of State. So please do take a seat and welcome. Please take your seat, Douglas.
Very nice to see you again. Very nice.
So, Silja Karin Mutka, let me get your perspective on what you've just heard on this kind of the best way of creating inclusivity when it comes to the green shift. Do you fear that Indigenous people risk being further marginalised as we head towards this?
I'm a great believer in solutions, and often I seem to hear the same call for solutions when I carry out meetings. I often tend to think, who is the owner of the problem? If we own the problem together, the solution must be crafted together. But it's important. You can't expect the solution from people who are not in a position to create those solutions. And then I'm talking about legislative powers or economical powers to build our communities. And we are still in a situation where we have inherited a lot of problems. Of course, I am aware of the problem with Russia, the breach of people's rights and the violation of Ukraine. But problems we have in the region, they have a long history. And the history, it's not a good history. That's the reason why both Sweden, Finland, and Norway have established a Truth and Reconciliation Committee to go through the politics that has been carried out towards the indigenous peoples. And it is those kind of aftermaths we have to cope with when we are crafting solutions.
So let's talk about those solutions.
Yeah.
What is the right way forward? Concrete progress to move on. What would you like to see? Some concrete action that would really make a difference?
For the first, I did say we do need to vitalize the Sami communities. We have a lot of institutional work to do, a lot of workplaces, a lot of creativity, other ways of thinking, other ways of viewing things, and a lot of knowledge of the environment we have been living in since time immemorial. And I think giving us the capacity to rebuild our communities is a very important first step.
Minister Huitfeldt, what do you say to that? Obviously, clearly, from the Sami side, there is still real progress that needs to be taken. Talk about workplaces and society across Norway. What do you think? How do you think should be moved on?
And also job opportunities. And I really think the Sami people have an advantage when we're talking about the green shift here in Norway, because your way of living with your very strong tradition combined with the way you are also modernizing Norway will be crucial to all of us, I think. So this is also an asset we have, the very close cooperation between indigenous peoples in this part of Norway. And you have actually been a driver in order to strengthen the cooperation between the Nordic countries in the region.
And just on this point, we have a question that's come through from Johan Franke, which says Indigenous participation in decision-making, especially in terms of climate mitigation, is essential. And do you see a chance to enhance this participation in the Arctic Council? While its work stopped. And how would you improve their inclusion? So what would you say to that? How should there be better inclusion, perhaps within the Arctic Council itself?
Well, as so many have stated, we do experience the global warming and the nature crisis very, very closely. And I think I could name 1,000 examples on how this is affecting us directly. But one thing is empowerment. Give us the tools so we can be active part in coping with the challenges we are facing. For instance, the gazing crisis we had last year, it was a long way down to the government. Of course, we were talking all the time, trying to craft some kind of solution, but I think we can meet this more flexible and more immediate. And those are examples where I would like to see a more inclusive way of dealing with the solutions.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just bring in Douglas Jones now. Let's get perspective from the US State Department. Now, you've talked about how cooperation needs to adapt, and it is adapting. In what way?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a great question, because we are definitely, without doubt, in a challenging period right now. And as people have said, Russia's aggression against Ukraine is really the greatest threat to the international rules-based order that we've faced since the Second World War. And I really appreciate Foreign Minister Gylfadottir's comments on why that's important, because this is not just an assault on Ukraine. This is an assault on the principles of the international rules-based order, the principles that underpin them, and they're principles that impact us all. But I think they, in particular, impact the Arctic, because it's a region that has really relied on the international rules-based order, and preserving that international rules-based order is critical if we're to achieve, the peaceful, prosperous, stable Arctic that we're all trying to achieve. So, I think there is no doubt that's why we must support Ukraine and ensure that this aggression does not prevail. And it's also why we had to freeze cooperation with Russia. But the imperative for international cooperation remains in the Arctic, and I think that cooperation can and should continue. It does continue, by the way, within the Arctic Council, so we've frozen cooperation with Russia, but cooperation among the other 7 states and continues. And the projects that don't involve Russia are going on. Those are actually the majority of Arctic Council projects. We had a great one here in October. Norway and the United States hosted a project as part of the Arctic Council's One Arctic, One Health initiative, where we brought together health practitioners, scholars, indigenous representatives for a workshop and exercise to plan out how we deal with health phenomena here in the Arctic. So this is going on now. I think it continues also bilaterally. We have to do more as the other 7 Arctic states together, and we can continue that. We have ourselves invested more in this. And I think if I were to talk about a third area, I think it's security, where we need to cooperate as well and can do more together. So we were already confronting militarization of the Arctic by Russia even before its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but it's become even more important now that we provide strong deterrence and defense, now that we've seen a Russia willing to use force against sovereign nations, and we need, if we are to have a peaceful Arctic, to have strong deterrence. And so we can do that through NATO as well as bilaterally.
Let me bring in Minister Huitfeldt here. So how do you see, for example, the militarization perhaps of the Arctic evolving going forward to meet those challenges?
Well, we need stronger military presence. We host a huge military exercise. That was in March last year. 30,000 soldiers from NATO countries and Sweden and Finland took place here in these waters. And that was a very important signal, I think, because our military presence in the north is based on deterrence and reinforcement, and we really have to train on that and conduct military exercises. At the same time, we need to be very predictable. We invited Russia as an observer to this military exercise, but they refused to come. So we need to act very predictable, so we don't see any misunderstandings and intended consequences. And that's also a part of the security system that we have here in the north. So we're trying to do our utmost to keep low tension in the high north.
Minister Billström, how do you see that challenge, trying to keep low tension in the high north going forward? And is this something that you think will be a key part of the EU-Swedish presidency?
Well, not perhaps of the Swedish EU presidency as such, but looking beyond that and looking to our NATO membership together with Finland, as has been stated many times throughout this conversation, it is obvious that when we have joined the alliance, this will bring more stability. We will bring well-equipped troops, well-trained troops. We will bring things which are good for NATO, which is going to enhance NATO capability, and it's going to be good for all the states in the NATO alliance, but it is also going to bring safety and security for all of us who populate this region. So from that point of view, I think that, again, Anniken is quite right. These kind of exercises that we conduct together is one part of doing it. Another is, based upon things which are of a more high-tech perspective. I'm talking about cyber, I'm talking about intelligence, I'm talking about all the things you need also to have a good cooperation beyond, beyond military means you also have security policy, and that is actually a broader field than simply military material, as we all know who are on this stage.
Douglas Jones, I just want to focus a little bit on the new US national strategy for the Arctic region. Now, this is being implemented to address many of the geopolitical issues currently we're facing right now. In what way do you think it will do this?
Well, it's going to do it in a lot of different ways. I mean, the strategy is very comprehensive, so it's not purely a security strategy. It's also focused greatly on climate change and how we adapt and how we help our communities in order to adapt to climate change. Security is an aspect of this. I think running throughout the entire report strategy is an emphasis on international cooperation. Even as the United States, we cannot address these common challenges alone, and we have to work with our partners and allies. And that is one of the imperatives, I think, that you're going to see as we tackle all these challenges.
And looking at the climate emergency in particular, what would you pick out within the strategy, the new US strategy, that really could help propel change and cooperation going forward?
Well, I think you've seen the rising investment that the United States is making in climate change. Of course, the Inflation Reduction Act, although it may be named after inflation, was really aimed at climate change. This is a $370 billion investment in addressing climate change, something of a scale we've never done before. So we are doubling down on our commitment to address climate change in all of its aspects.
Okay, thank you. Talking about that specific on investment, it is often argued that perhaps businesses, when perhaps there is a big political freeze going on because of geopolitical fracture and the difficulties of trying to get agreement on a high political level, that actually businesses can move the dial, as it were. Do you see that from an Icelandic perspective, that actually sometimes businesses can actually make more progress than policymakers?
In regards to climate, or?
Yes.
Well, it's material for a whole day to discuss the kind of increased blurred lines between, the macro economy development policy making and businesses.
But when you look at, say, COP27, you know, there seemed to be this real disappointment that actually there isn't that high-level agreement among nations on so many different measures. But at the same time, in business forums, there are changes being made. Yeah, let me. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, sorry. I think you know, for some businesses move faster than politicians and policies. Sometimes businesses don't move. They just doesn't move until, you know, we have a policy that says, okay, please, you have to go in this direction. And there's also a mismatch, in my personal opinion, when politicians have a clear policy on something, which is kind of easy to put on paper, but we don't have the solutions, we don't have the tools, we don't have the capital, we don't have what it takes to make it happen. And sometimes I think politicians don't really understand the importance of getting the private sector and companies and businesses on board, because, you know, it doesn't matter how fancy policies we make. You know, we know that, for example, the climate, politicians are not going to fix the climate crisis. That's obvious. But we all have our roles to play. So hopefully what would be best is when it becomes a good business to do what's right. And too often, I say this as a capitalist, too often it doesn't seem to be the best, you know, the best for the market to do what's right. So, but when that goes together, then we make magic. And that's what we need when it comes to climate, and also when it comes to other issues, such as value-based business decisions. For example, when we buy products that we all need, but we don't want to buy from violent authoritarians.
A really quick comment. Yeah, I think businesses are kind of aware that they have to change their ways of operation, for example, when it comes to climate change. And they can do quick things, but they need a predictable legislative playground. And I have experienced that some companies have been even like being a little bit frustrated that sometimes political system or legislation is lagging because they want to know what kind of legislative playground they are operating in the next 5 or 10 or 15 years, because they want to make investments that don't outdate next year if legislation changes or so. So that's why we need business-government cooperation in that also, especially in climate change, to make that playground where the legislation kind of also encourages businesses to take more sustainable way.
Selimutka, do you feel as though the Sámi voice is heard within the business community?
I will contact any business and inform them on the importance to respect human rights and indigenous rights. If their governments fail us, I will get them to understand how important it is to safeguard human rights, and it's a global value to safeguard human rights, and indigenous rights are part of that. So I have gotten loads of criticism for engaging with big corporations and informing them on the parliamentary decisions we have made with regards to specific projects. And I must say, I find that they will listen to us. I think they understand business risk on that level. For it is not good business to breach human rights or indigenous rights.
When you say you've had criticism, where has that criticism come from?
That criticism comes from a lot of other politicians and also from media. But it's my duty. I must inform the world on the decisions made in my parliament. I find it totally natural, and also I think the businesses, they do appreciate it because they do not monitor every part of the world. So when we are telling them this project will violate indigenous rights, that is something they will take into account, and they will assess the risk of breaching human rights. And I find that politicians, on the other hand, they can, in some cases, they can unfortunately overlook that important value.
Okay, thank you. Let me bring you in from Norway's perspective. Do you think that politicians can actually really act as a great bridge, or do you think actually sometimes it does come better right from the heart of a community, in that cooperation and communication with business when it comes to key issues concerning, for example, the green transition?
On the energy field, there are very, very strong cooperation between decision makers and businesses. We have seen that a lot after this war broke out. So I spent more and more time cooperating with businesses in Norway, but also makers in countries like Egypt, India. They are all extremely eager to get access to green renewable energy. So this new cooperation, I think, will be even stronger in the years to come.
Okay, thank you. And Douglas Jones, what is there, would you say, in the US, the new US strategy you're explaining, that could almost act as a bit of a blueprint when it comes to the experience that the United States has had in this field of ensuring, you know, a better transition or upholding of Indigenous people's rights at the same time as propelling kind of economic gain?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's one of the, inclusion of our local communities and our Indigenous populations is a key element of our strategy that we've learned. You know, if we're to have real solutions and sustainable solutions, they have to come from there. And so, and we are facing huge impacts on our communities from climate change that we can see coming as we see permafrost thawing out is impacting our communities. More severe weather is having huge impacts. Changing water levels is going to force us to move communities. And so we're going to have to do a lot of adapting ourselves nationally, and this is going to take huge investment. And all of those answers, we think, can only come with the involvement of local communities and our Indigenous populations. And so I think that's a lesson I think we've learned. I think all of us have learned, but certainly we're trying to implement that in our national strategy.
Okay, well, many thanks. Now, we are going to have to move on from this stage of the debate, and I would really like to thank the Foreign Ministers and State Secretary for your really insightful comments and really leading the discussion, so we cover so many different points. So thank you very much. I do appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. You'd like to leave the stage. Thank you. Thanks very much. So now, we are going to move on to the next part of this debate. And I just want to set the scene a little more about what we're going to be focusing, because, of course, as we've just been discussing, we are facing a brand new landscape. We've lost a significant a stakeholder in Russia, of course. But is there an increased role to play for other nations outside the Arctic? And just what role would that be? How would it take shape? And how could that increased participation in what's happening in the Arctic region really make a difference? Well, we're going to watch a short film now, and these are perspectives from some of the Arctic's emerging leaders.
Climate change is causing many issues. Combined with geopolitics, this is turning the Arctic into a pressure cooker.
How will the situation be when our generation is 60 years old and the Arctic is even more accessible, developable, and dynamic?
These issues and the growing space for conflict demand increased communication, coordination, consultation, and consent. Importantly, this will need to take place across all scales, from local land users and communities to entire industries and nations. We see three major concerns.
First, the expectations for Arctic development by international interests are often misaligned with those of local and Indigenous communities. The norm does not practice power sharing.
Second, the glacial pace of evidence-based policymaking is lagging behind the current needs and tense atmosphere of the North.
Finally, getting it right the first time will be critical. There is no time and there will be no do-overs.
We all need to ensure collaboration between genders, generations, sectors, nations, stakeholders, and right holders who right now stand far apart. How will you get moving?
So some really great questions and some great points raised in that video. And I do want to remind you all that you can please participate in this debate as well by sending your questions through on the platform, and I'll pick them up on my iPad just with me on stage. But I'm going to invite two new voices onto the panel now who are really going to provide some extra insight. So please welcome David Bolton, who is Executive Director of the Arctic Executive Steering Committee, USA. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
And we have another David Shukman, who is a journalist, actually a former colleague of mine at the BBC, because he was a former BBC science editor, and he is now a visiting professor at the Gramson Research Institute. So welcome, David.
Thank you.
Welcome both Davids
Thank you.
to the stage. So I'd really like to ask you, David Bolton, just to kick off. You know, you have huge experience, of course, of working with the Arctic Council as chair of senior Arctic officials. What path do you see ahead? We've talked about all this confusion, the fact that some activities, there was press pause, others have restarted again. What do you see over the kind of short to medium term anyway?
The Arctic Council has never been in a place it is today. I watched it grow from a small and not well-known organization to become the premier diplomatic forum for the Arctic. And a lot has been accomplished over the last decade. But now we face, the Arctic Council faces a real challenge. A lot is being lost, Susanna. The data from Russia, for example, on climate issues, which was never great to begin with, is now basically dried up. And cooperation with Russia, as others have said, is basically at a standstill. We need somehow to keep a little pilot light lit for now in hopes of a better future, because I think the Arctic Council plays a vital role and hopefully one day can resume that role it has played. People have spoken about the role of indigenous peoples in the Arctic Council. I have spent my life working in international organizations of one kind or another, and I can tell you I've never seen anything quite like the Arctic Council in terms of indigenous involvement. It is the high water mark, and for them as well as for the Arctic nations, we need to find a way back. But of course this depends on Russia. Russia has placed itself beyond the pale. What is going on in Ukraine has made it impossible to cooperate with them in the Arctic Council.
Yeah, well, let me just bring in you again, Silvio. Given David's comments about the Arctic Council, there have been some complaints that I've heard about because some of the activities, there was a pause pressed on those and other kind of unofficial channels were used. But do you still feel as though there is a voice for Sami peoples?
Yes, of course, the Arctic Council has a very good model because the indigenous peoples are represented at the table, and that's a very, very good example. Of course, it can be evolved even more, in my opinion, but that is, of course, another debate. With regards to the situation on Russia, I must say, for us, we are a people living in 4 different national states, and we have brothers and sisters, Sami brothers and sisters on the Russian side. And the situation with the collaboration now is, it's at the state it was when it was the Cold War. So the contact is very reduced, and it's vital for us as people to be able to have that connection and also to be able to meet and try to strengthen the Sami culture together, because it is important, and so we feel like we have lost so much on such a short time.
Okay, thank you. Let me bring in David Shukman now, because you've also said, David, that actually you feel as though it's more important that the world grasps right now what's at stake. It's never been more important. Let's look at the Arctic from that perspective. You know, you're the BBC science editor, you visited the Arctic 16 times. Do you think sometimes the perception of how the Arctic is viewed from the outside can actually limit progress and limit what's needed to take place in terms of awareness around the world?
I think very much so. I mean, the bad news for this forum is that beyond the Arctic, I would suggest most people on the planet don't really have a clue what it is. I mean, one of my first trips was to report on the melting of the Greenland ice sheet, and I got back to the BBC newsroom, and one of my senior editors, a very well-read individual, came up to me to say, "Well done, David. That was a brilliant report from Antarctica." Right? Now, that's the BBC newsroom making that mistake, right? I mean, just think beyond. So I think there's a massive gulf of ignorance. It's not malign, it's just a fact. I mean, what happened a few years back? The former US-American president, Donald Trump, wanted to buy Greenland, right? I mean, if that doesn't reveal ignorance about the Arctic, I don't know what does. And I think an additional source of confusion, which is a reflection of the debate that I've just heard over the last hour, and really fascinating, is the contradictory narratives about the Arctic. I mean, is it a good thing or a bad thing if a whole load more ships can sail right over the roof of the world? It might be very good for indigenous communities to get more trade, more contact, more employment. In a planetary sense, it's probably catastrophic. Think of all the emissions, the pollution, and so forth. That applies to economic development generally. Is it a good thing locally? It probably is. Is it a bad thing in a planetary sense, given that, I mean, I read a lot of IPCC science. I mean, you know, this region acts as one of the planet's 2 air conditioning units. And frankly, we're kicking it pretty hard, and so that it might break and just vanish.
Why is there this kind of perceptual misunderstanding then, and how can we change that?
So I think one thing is that if people have heard of the Arctic, it's possibly Lapland, Santa Claus, reindeer, polar bears, right? And I'm sorry to say, but that really...
That must be frustrating, given
It's
the number
very
of reports
frustrating.
that
I mean, you're talking to someone who's been coming to this region for 20 years and have been personally committed to educating BBC audiences about the importance of this region. And it's an uphill struggle. What I think is, particularly now, in this very perilous time, as we've heard so clearly from other speakers, it matters more than ever that everybody who knows about the region, whatever their walk of life, helps with that role of being an ambassador, an educator to a wide audience, whatever their contacts are in business or whatever else it is, because I think now more than ever, the wider world needs to understand the significance of this region and really why it matters.
Douglas Jones, do you share some of David's frustrations?
I do. I think it's a good point that there are a lot of misconceptions out there that we deal with. I think another one that we confront is a misperception of the Arctic as sort of ungoverned space. And this is one that also causes challenges because it's not actually. It's actually well-governed space where we have international conventions, we have the law of the sea, we have exclusive economic zones and extended continental shelves of some of the most regulated states in the world, and most of the territory is national territory. And so I think we have a system that has worked well that we need to preserve and continue. It's part of what I was talking about earlier, and the importance of upholding the international rules-based order, which has worked effectively in the Arctic, and we need to preserve. And I think that applies also to the Arctic Council, where we want to preserve it as a vessel for international cooperation. Russia has excluded itself. But the institution should remain.
So, David, the Arctic Council is on a pilot light. So then where should cooperation be fired up?
Well, there's plenty that can still be done in the Arctic Council, only without Russian involvement currently. And more than half the projects, for example, the Arctic Council is currently working on do not involve Russia. But there are other venues as well. So shipping, for example, is the province of the International Maritime Organization. Recently, there have been some measures that have come through the IMO to regulate shipping in the Arctic. Not strong enough, in my view, but perhaps more can be done there. There are other agreements. There is a fisheries agreement for the Arctic Ocean. Actually, the parties just had their first meeting in Seoul. And November included Russia, interestingly, sort of slipped in below the political radar screen. But there was a form of cooperation about the Arctic region that was allowed to move forward. So there are ways, but we are going to need, speaking for the US now, to reach out more to our allies and partners, find new ways of cooperate, essentially to make up for the fact that the biggest nation in the Arctic has placed itself beyond the pale.
And what form could those new ways of cooperation take?
Well, there's a lot of science that we need to step up to somehow make up for the lack of data coming out from Arctic. There are new types of renewable energy projects, for example, that in North America we can work on with Canada. There is a need for more critical minerals and more secure supply of critical minerals in the world. Some of those may exist in the Arctic. Can they be developed sustainably? We need to find that out. Those are things we could work on together with other nations.
And talking about, you just mentioned, of course, other international institutions. Sinumotka, what's your experience been when you've been asked to participate, for example, at an EU level or at a UN level? Do you feel as though that amplifies your voice around the world? And does that then reverberate back to perhaps changing policy here?
Well, we have seen a lot of national politics towards the Sami issues. It has been driven also by big international processes. So it is very important to be a part of the dialogue where you have the access and the possibility and capacity to participate. And with regards to my experience, I find we have some sort of the same problem with the enhanced participation, both in the UN system, but we could also, of course, discuss that with regards to EU also. It is the question of how the indigenous voice are incorporated into the processes that are mainly state-driven, and also the representativity in those processes. We have had some solutions with regards to representation and indigenous voices within the climate negotiations and on the Convention on Biological Diversity. We are working with the same thing, and within the food systems, the states have started a work in order to prioritize food systems, and that's very important for us also, the indigenous peoples. And we have the indigenous world. We have also organized our collaboration and our work in 7 different regions. So we often tend to go back to those regions and work together with the parties we know so very well, and we try to have good dialogues on how we should raise the different issues. But what I'm really advocating here is I hope that the states will give us the space within the food system follow-up, and also be sure that the indigenous voices are heard, because there is a lot of knowledge on the natural renewable resources with regards to food, and also the systems that it takes to maintain good, healthy, and secure food.
Douglas, I heard you say yes in agreement just then. What can you add to what Sinumotka's just explained?
No, I was just nodding along to her
Yeah.
comment as we look for answers here. Many of them, lie with the communities that have been dealing with them and finding solutions for generations. And so I think I strongly agree with her point. We can only find these answers working with our indigenous populations and local communities.
I might add that in the US, we just put out new guidance, the Biden administration did, on including indigenous knowledge into government decision-making wherever possible, and that includes in the Arctic too. And to be a representative of the US federal government is to have very powerful obligations to our own Native Americans, particularly our Arctic indigenous populations in this context. And we are finding new ways to work together. It's imperative that we do.
But what would you say about the role, the greater role that nations outside the Arctic really need to play? Because there's a lot of focus on what the Arctic needs to do to stop climate change and how it's the Arctic's responsibility. But David, do you think there's a lack of awareness still that actually what happens in other countries around the world really affects the ice melting here and the difficulties that so many populations across the lands will face?
Yeah, I think if you go back to the climate science and look at the scenarios that are most plausible for where we're heading, the globe is heading for a rise of 2.5, 3 degrees by the end of the century. I mean, if there's a dramatic change of events and of policy, maybe we can keep the lid on that rise to maybe below 2, but I think 1.5 looks less and less plausible. So then it's reasonable to ask, what does that mean in the parts of the world that are most vulnerable? Now, I know the Arctic is warming faster than the global average, and we've heard about the impact on communities, but can I just flip this right round for a second? If you look at communities that are on a vastly bigger scale than any here, in the tropics and the subtropics, parts of those, regions of the world are going to become harder and harder to live in. And hundreds of millions of people, this is not science fiction, possibly 1 billion, are going to need to move to places that are cooler. And I don't know if the Arctic collectively is ready for what is coming, not next Tuesday, not in 5 years, but over the next 50. I think we're going to see population movement on a dramatic scale we haven't seen perhaps since the Second World War. And I think that's really going to test Arctic cooperation. It's going to be challenging for indigenous people. I mean, I thought it was a very interesting intervention from the minister from Iceland, saying there's this great untapped resource in the Arctic of human potential, which I thought was a really interesting and positive point. Well, how about an influx of millions of people bringing their talents, their knowledge, often to countries with aging populations that need the labor? I mean, I think we're talking about a potentially enormous shift in the role of the Arctic, the parts of the world that are cooler, as a recipient of huge numbers of people who are going to need a home. I'm seeing some nodding from some people. Maybe others are thinking, what is this guy on?
Well, actually, I interviewed Nouriel Roubini, who was called Dr. Doom because of his predictions of the financial crisis. And one of the theses in his book is all about mega threats that the world is facing right now, is that there could then be a collision between China and Russia because of migration of populations into Siberia. So, interesting, train of thought, really, isn't it? Certainly, it is being taken on about this huge population shift. But I just want to find out from you, Doug, whether this modelling is in the US strategy, over the longer term, and how do you foresee really the Arctic dealing with that?
Sure. I mean, we were reading the same scientific reports and the same predictions of what we're looking at in terms of temperature change and all the consequences that could have for us, which would be vast. And I think it's right to say that other non-Arctic nations certainly are interested in what's happening here. What happens elsewhere in the world is having huge impacts in the Arctic, but also what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic. It impacts those countries as well. So I think we certainly welcome their input into the work here, while preserving the leading role for the Arctic nations in dealing with the Arctic in the future going forward. Mm-hmm.
And David Bolton, do you think that the Arctic Council is ready for the kind of the big migration, as David Shupman is predicting?
I don't know if the Arctic Council will be the recipient of a billion people.
Have there been discussions about the effects of migration?
There has not in the Arctic Council, to my knowledge, been that. There's been a different kind of migration to the Arctic Council. This took place before the invasion of Ukraine, and that was all sorts of countries and organizations sought and succeeded in becoming observers to the Arctic Council. They wanted to become involved in the Arctic. And I saw that as a good thing. The Arctic, while the Arctic states have the lead, there are very legitimate interests that non-Arctic states and all sorts of organizations have in what is going on in the Arctic climate, being first and foremost among them. But there are other issues too. And there are a lot of other countries from outside the Arctic that have long histories of doing science in the Arctic, something we ought to be encouraging more. But no, I cannot recall, at least in my time in the Arctic Council, there being a discussion of mass migration to the Arctic.
And do you see, we're talking about this, but overall, what's your perspective, on migration? Is there enough, for example, at the moment, there doesn't appear to be enough transport links, housing for populations within the north to allow them to have greater employment opportunities, and certainly if there is an even bigger migration, this will become even more crucial. What is your take on this? Because of course there are two sides, aren't there, to this debate, I imagine from your perspective.
Yes, we are a very welcoming people, but I think history has taught us we must have a good framework in order to cope with such possibilities or challenges, whatever you would like to call it. But I think it's important that we do not repeat the same mistakes that have been done before. We have always had migration in this area, and for a lot of indigenous peoples, those meetings are at the core of the problems we find in these dialogues, and also in crafting good political solutions for the future. And I often say when we are talking about why should we engage in big international processes, we are just a small people with a little voice. But I think the inspiration to take some steps in another direction, it must come from people who has another perspective, and they can even have a very small voice. And sometimes that small voice can give us something that we can take and use as a guideline, or take and use as an inspiration to take those necessary steps. Because as a politicians, I must also admit that it's not always that I can incorporate my enthusiasm for my political views into everybody's head. And I think the core decision on taking those steps, it is within each and one of us.
Mm-hmm. And David, I just wanted to pick up on a point that you said about this invitation of the nations to observe the workings of the Arctic Council, and to put that. But what benefit have you seen from that? That the outside, bringing the outside in.
So a lot of the observer nations and organizations have contributed experts and ideas. They have contributed some funding to certain types of projects. There is a rule from the Arctic Council that no project should have more than 50% funding from observers, but that still allows for a lot of resources to come in. Some of the observers have made special efforts to engage with the so-called permanent participants, the representatives of the Arctic indigenous peoples in the Council. All of this to the better. All of this to the better. There are certain types of Arctic Council projects. I'll give you one. It's to protect migratory birds in the Arctic. Well, those birds have flyways that include areas outside the Arctic. In order to do that successfully, you need the cooperation of the other states, some of whom are Arctic Council observers. Here's another example. In order to successfully limit black carbon emissions that deposit in the Arctic, you would need the cooperation of states from below the Arctic Circle, the emissions from which sometimes deposit north of the Arctic Circle, to cooperate. So those are just some examples of why the observer system is beneficial.
Great, thank you. I'd like to put this question, which has come through to you, David. It's come from Heidi Sylvester. Arctic warming does not mean it will become more welcoming, quite the opposite. Wilder weather, more unpredictable conditions. How are we preparing people to adapt to these changes, and when are we phasing out fossil fuels to avoid the worst consequences of climate change in the Arctic and beyond? I mean, I think probably the second part of that question is really relevant, given our conversation we had just before about, whether what's happening with the geopolitical fracture will delay or accelerate the green transition and the phasing out of fossil fuels.
I think the immediate answer is that more coal is being burnt in a number of European countries to make up a shortfall of Russian gas. But I think in the medium term, there's been an enormous acceleration of interest and investment in renewable technologies. I think we'll look back in perhaps 5 years' time, and hopefully in a time of peace, and look back at this moment thinking that's when the kick-starting of heat pumps, wind, solar. I mean, I was reading this morning that last year, the European Union generated more electricity from wind and solar than from gas for the first time. Now, you know, we are in a process of rapid transition. It's got to go an awful lot farther and faster to minimize the risks of accelerated warming. The questioner, by the way, is absolutely right. Climate change does not automatically mean benign conditions in the Arctic. Wilder weather is definitely part of that. I just think the argument is there are going to be parts of the world that are not just experiencing wilder weather, but that are uninhabitable. And where do those people go? Now, they may have a misguided notion that they'll have a more comfortable existence up in northern countries. But let's see when we get there. No, I think there's going to be, I just can't think of a set of circumstances where it's more important that dialogue continues in as many ways as possible, countries in the Arctic and outside it, and that trust is maintained. And that's trust geopolitically, pretty tricky right now with Russia, also on an indigenous scale, because we know there's a legacy of a pretty dark legacy in many ways, and that has to be overcome. And let's look forward to a time when that's possible.
Yes. Thank you. And just one more question. Actually, let me bring you in.
Yes, I was just going to comment on the energy politics. It's really something that creates a large. It is a threat to the indigenous societies. In Norway, we have one example. It's the High Court ruling on the Fosen case, where one of the North European biggest wind power plant was built in a gazing area for southern Sami, a small family-driven population. And so the High Court has stated that the Norwegian government has breached the Convention on Civil and Political Rights, Article 27, and it was an unanimously High Court ruling. And we are over a year since the day that the verdict was stated, but there has been no action in order to do something to stop the violation of human rights and indigenous rights. And I think Europe needs to know this, and I think the states need to know this. It must be a just green shift or just climate measures we are taking. Of course, we as a people, we must live as we have lived in these extreme conditions, weather conditions throughout since time immemorial. But today, I think we are facing the kind of the moral claim that we should self-sacrifice in order to try to cope with crisis. The world leaders seems unable to take measures to meet.
Okay, well, many thanks. And I just want to, lead on from that point that you're making with the final question, I think, for the panel today is what specifically is, we're talking about the American Arctic here, how is the US federal government ensuring Alaskans' voices are at the forefront of developing US Arctic strategy? And this has come from Jackson Blackwell. Can you take that, Doug?
Sure, I'll take it jointly with David, but I think you can read it front and center in our Arctic strategy, how we're committed to, as I mentioned before, involving our local communities and our local voices in policy making going forward. They're the ones who will bear the brunt of what's happening, and we know we're going to have huge adaptations to make as well. And so I think that's going to happen in a number of ways. Specifically, it's really engagement at all different levels, at local and municipal and federal levels, that we're looking to increase that engagement.
And David, the final
so,
word?
One of my big jobs is to implement the new U.S. National Strategy for the Arctic region. I can tell you I'm in touch with Alaskans, the state of Alaska, Alaskan people, Alaskan indigenous groups almost every day to get their input on how best to proceed.
Okay, good to hear. Well, thank you so much to all the panellists here on the stage now and those who preceded them. It's been really, really insightful debates.
Right.
And it's certainly clear, isn't it, that actually keeping all of those lines of communication are absolutely vital because, as was one of the questions and statements made in that video, there is no time for do-overs, and it does seem quite right. And Andreas, it certainly seems as though there is progress in voicing concerns as well about the geopolitical situation compared to in May in many ways.
I think the very strong statement for me as a social scientist today was like, who is the owner of a problem? And I don't think that's an Arctic issue per se, but I think it's a global problem, a global question we can ask as researchers, as media, or as NGOs, or as individuals. You know, who is the owner of a certain problem, and how can we deal with it together, here in the Arctic or beyond the Arctic? So I think that's a very strong one.
And Andreas is going to be picking up lots of these points during the Arctic Town Hall, aren't you, with Break TV? But I understand that maybe you need to scamper off to go and do Break TV.
I soon need to move north or outside, so I hope I find my way there. But yeah, again, just a few reminders, you know, regardless what's happening in the world, for example, regardless what's happening with Twitter, please tweet, share, and like, you know, what's happening here in the Arctic. Use hashtag Moving North or hashtag AF2023. We also have a Flickr account. So if you see yourself on Flickr, you want to download yourself, share it with the world, you can do so. Just again, use our photographer as the copyright holder. Other than that, you already mentioned the town hall event. So at 5:30, we have an event here, the so-called town hall event. You might remember it from last year. We will again discuss governing risk, the future of Arctic cooperation. The idea of a town hall event is that you, as the audience, actually engage with the expert on stage. So please join me here at 5:30. And afterwards, we have the now very famous Bechacucha science event at Sturtgata Camping. Sturtgata Camping has mini golf plus a science event, so I don't think I need to sell that event even better and more. Bechacucha, what is it? It's called chit-chatting in Japanese, something for us to learn. Speakers get 20 slides and have 20 seconds per slide to explain their science. So please join us there at the Bechacucha event. I will be there. Before that, the town hall event, and I guess it's now time for coffee. And again, if you want to hop online, you can watch me and two of my guests at the breakout TV session. Other than that,
so no more Bechacucha.
No more Bechacucha.
Andreas is on the move. And I'll be back tomorrow for the next big picture session where we're focusing on food on the move. So do join me tomorrow. Thank you very much.
I think the future opportunities in the Arctic lie partly in the development of new resources and new technologies, but mostly in new ways to look at the Arctic, at its resources and its people.
My vision for the Arctic is that we can be frontrunners in cutting emission by focusing on sustainability in all sectors of society, from transportation, education, health services, to waste management and housing.
My vision for the Arctic.
I think the future opportunities in the Arctic lie partly in the development of new resources and new technologies, but mostly in new ways to look at the Arctic, at its resources and its people.
My vision for the Arctic is that we can be frontrunners in cutting emission by focusing on sustainability in all sectors of society, from transportation, education, health services, to waste management and housing.
My vision for the Arctic is for its unique ecosystem to be celebrated for its resilience and adaptability in the face of climate change, and for it to be preserved for future generations.
My vision for the Arctic is that it remains free of conflict and that efforts to ensure sustainability and local needs are prioritized.
My vision for the Arctic is a region.
Was not that easy, but here we are. I promised you 2 guests, and we have a little chit-chat about what has happened in the last 1.5 hours. Let me quickly introduce our guest. To my right, to your left, we have Randy Church-Key, who is the Senior Advisor for Arctic Security Affairs at the newly established Ted Stevens Center for Arctic Security Studies. Welcome to Tromsø. And to my left, I have Ronald Varnes, right, Vice Chair of Troms and Finnmark County Council. So you're based here in Tromsø.
Yes.
Again, thank you to make it here to the edge.
Thank you.
Let's start with you, Church. So we have heard a lot about stability, continuity. When I started to study the Arctic 10, 12 years ago, I heard a lot about the US being a reluctant Arctic power. Now we have seen many strategies coming from US ministries or departments, how you call it. We have your newly established center. Can you tell us a bit what has happened over the last few years in the US when it comes to Arctic research, Arctic politics?
That's a great question, and I will tell you, Andreas, that from my vantage point, that's a narrative that I've heard in the past, that the United States is a reluctant Arctic nation. I would actually counter that. The United States is a committed Arctic nation. We've been an Arctic nation since 1867. Our policies broadly that focus on security, economic development, Arctic research and more, is, to me, the facts really kind of outflank that narrative. That the United States as an Arctic nation has been strongly committed to our national interests, and then of course national interests that are in partnership with our allies and security partners across the region. I would say that there is a renewed sense over the last several years, and security, of course, is a new part of the dimension, but there's also the fact that the Arctic is this region where the climate is generating so much impact to the lower latitudes of the Northern Hemisphere that science in the Arctic region and cooperation really matters as well. So when the Arctic, you're looking at 3 pillars that are really kind of oriented to our national interests, and first is security dimension with our allies and partners. Second of all is the aspect about trying to see what's happening in the region climate-wise and what are the impacts really across the Northern Hemisphere. And third, about the aspects of the economic development, again, with our allies and partners, about their own national interests, really center on those 3 pillars.
Can I put your new center in context with what we have heard with one of the panelists, untap human resources? How does that work? You know, like, so we have to untap human resources, as many other resources in the Arctic, and now you have a really interesting new center established. So how does that play out for you?
First of all, Andres, people matter most. Okay, and people are, I thought the panelists made the remark about people are our most important resource. When you look at the aspect of what the center does is just part of a community of regional centers, the 6 DoD regional centers that are really the soft power complement for the United States, that they're focused essentially complementing that of the hard power investments we're making in the area of both mostly on security, but then those things that relate to climate security. People are our most important resource. Helping the practitioner-focused education. One of the pillars of our center is really that practitioner educational basis, and then leveraging the power of people to do research analysis that benefit the tough problems and then contribute across the community of Arctic researchers that, for us, more focus on the security dimensions, but realizing that security is about one part of that dimension. Then lastly, of course, looking at the third pillar, we have a center that is directly involved with people, strategic engagement. The idea of the power of convening, forums such as this, where you learn from others about ideas that I've heard about them in the past, but sharper focus, perhaps more collaborative outcomes. To me, there's goodness in leveraging the power of people across all 3 of those pillars that we're privileged to champion for our department and as part of the United States.
Fantastic. Let's turn to the policymaker. Untap human resources, you know, here in the Arctic. What did it trigger when you hear that?
It's such an interesting dimension in the Arctic, because the big problem we have as a region
is actually that we have lots of jobs, but we don't have people. So it's a big paradox of living in the Arctic, that we have lots of resources, we have lots of development. It's a very exciting area to live in, but we still can't get qualified people and workers and decision makers and all things that makes up a complete human society. So that's a big paradox, and it's also, of course, a sad perspective of living in the Arctic. So it's very good that both the Minister of Foreign Policy said it, that there's no security without people and there's no people without security, and that's the core of what we're challenging. So it's a very good point.
Let's talk about security, and we are 1 year into an exceptional crisis. Let's put it that way. Here with you in Tromsø and the County Council, how that collaboration, continues or not continue, or can you tell us a bit about the last year?
Yeah, that's not even an elephant in the room anymore. The Russian issue. Of course, we see now that Finnmark, which is a part of Tromsø and Finnmark, is the only NATO border towards Russia, and it's only 200 kilometers wide. And now, with things are turning really fast, we see, especially Finland, from our perspective, coming into NATO. We both hope and believe that this will happen, and also Sweden. Then we will turn our perspective from a horizontal perspective and to a more vertical, down south to North Finland and North Sweden. And it's very interesting to see that change, because we cannot change geographical facts. We're the neighbor of Russia, but we have to change how we cooperate, and we'll just pray for peace. But in the meantime, we have to change our focus.
As a follow-up question to that, to both of you, and so this year's theme of the conference is moving north, Let's continue that thought and say, okay, let's move forward the discussion. What will we discuss in 5 or 10 years at Arctic Frontiers based on untapping human resources, on an exceptional security crisis, more than only one crisis if we include the climate change crisis?
As Anu opened with, we have to get up and move forward, and that's really the point. We cannot just sit back and say that this is a permanent situation. We have to move on, and we have to change our point of view. And I think, of course, then in 10 years we have a totally different dynamic situation in the Arctic, and hopefully peace, of course. And then we can continue with cooperation across all the Arctic part of the world.
Well, first of all, just one point of clarification. The United States also has a border with Russia. We're about a mile and a half between Little Diomede Island, Big Diomede Island, and the Bering Straits. Just a small point. It's a great question that you offered. So to me, several things that really need to unpack. We only get a cameo of that right now, but I'll put a tickler out. So number one, if you look at 5 to 10 years from now, there is going to be the ramifications of an accelerating change in climate. So we got to get past the point of talking about the problem and now offering some solutions that actually are then implemented. So we're in the transition from the discussions about the causes to addressing the symptoms in order to provide some solutions, because otherwise the conditions are getting to the spot where we're going to have a hard time for people to adapt to such, the extremes of a changing climate in that regards. So the second piece of this, of course, is the security dimension. There is a competition for resources in different parts of the world. The Arctic has not been a place where that competition has been manifest. What will be the security implications 5 to 10 years from now when we realize that at least one significant Arctic player has completely violated the rules-based order? And because of that, what are the downstream implications? Will other countries think they can get away with that? Or will there be a lesson learned and we can find a rapprochement aspect, not only, of course, in the Arctic, but other places where nations willingly choose to violate the rules-based order? That's going to be interesting to see what's happening between now and that time to the future.
If I can follow up, Randy has a very good point of view when it comes to the climate situation, because we feel it here and now. The Arctic has actually 3 times more impact and 3 times faster impact when it comes to the climate crisis, and we have to deal with it now. When we drive around our region, we actually see hay not meant for cattle, human-produced hay for the reindeers, because the reindeers are not being able to dig through the ice layer when it comes to milder winters in the Arctic. So that shows us that the climate situation and the climate challenges are here and right now. So it's very important to see that also in a security perspective. Yeah.
And actually, let me hop on this for a second. So the aspect of the fact that if you're going to the intertwining of how you find solutions to a changing climate to economic development. For example, can you make infrastructure investments in places where the permafrost is in degradation? Can you find ways like, okay, as permafrost continues to degrade, what are some new generation and infrastructure investments in order to enable economic opportunity?
And of course, there's lots of natural minerals and natural resources in the Arctic, and you have to balance that when it comes to protecting the indigenous people and all the environmental challenges that we face, also by taking out these resources. So it's a very complicated theme and a complicated scene we have to operate on. But I'm really convinced that we can do it.
Like, I have so many more follow-up questions, but I already got the sign that we are over time. So thank you very much for joining me in this very short summary. But again, many more things we have to discuss, like complex cooperation, maybe also between regions in the Arctic. So there's plenty more things we have to discuss. I'll see you on stage tomorrow or the day after.
Yeah, tomorrow.
Tomorrow, okay. Then again, thank you very much for joining me. And please follow us again. Continuously follow us here at the Arctic Frontiers Conference, and I'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you.